The shovel hit concrete 3 feet down, and I remember thinking that was my biggest problem that morning. Mrs. Patterson's plot. Wrong measurements from the surveyor. I'd have to call the office, refile paperwork, dig 6 feet to the left. Standard Tuesday frustration at Riverside Memorial Cemetery. Then Marcus came running through the gates, screaming about bodies moving downtown. I'm standing there waist-deep in a half-finished grave, watching my only co-worker sprint past the Victorian section like something's chasing him. Marcus never runs. The guy takes smoke breaks that last 40 minutes. But now he's practically hurdling headstones, his face the color of old newspaper, and he's not slowing down to explain. He just keeps shouting the same thing over and over. They're eating people, Cole. They're actually eating people. He doesn't stop at the maintenance shed. Doesn't grab his jacket or his keys from the cottage. He goes straight through the back gate, the one we keep locked, the one that leads into the residential neighborhoods, and I never see him again. I stood in that hole for maybe 2 minutes, dirt-caked shovel in my hands, trying to decide if Marcus had finally cracked. 3 years of working among the dead, maybe it got to him. Happened to a guy before I started here, according to the groundskeeper logs. Just walked out mid-shift one October, left a note about too many whispers, but then I heard the sirens. Not one or two, a wall of them coming from every direction, overlapping until it sounded like the entire city was screaming. I climbed out of the grave, irony wasn't lost on me even then, and walked to the front gates. Riverside Memorial sits on a hill, 50 acres of rolling terrain studded with 2 centuries of headstones, mausoleums, and memorial gardens. From the entrance, you can see straight down into the valley where the old downtown district spreads out like a gray circuit board. Smoke was rising from at least 6 different locations. Traffic on the main highway had stopped moving. I could see the glint of sunlight off motionless cars stretching back for miles, and the sound. Even from 2 miles away, even with all those sirens, I could hear something underneath it all. A sound like the ocean, if the ocean was made of screaming. My phone started buzzing. Text messages, rapid fire, from numbers I didn't recognize, emergency alerts. The screen was filled with contradictory instructions. Shelter in place. Evacuate immediately. Avoid hospitals. Proceed to nearest hospital. Do not approach affected individuals. Affected individuals. That's what they were calling them. I tried calling my brother in Portland. Network busy. Tried my ex-girlfriend just to make sure she was okay. Same thing. The last text I received that made any sense came from a college friend who worked at the fire station. It's not a riot. They're sick. Really sick. Don't let them bite you. Don't let them bite you. I looked back at the cottage. The keeper's cottage, technically. A small stone building smack in the center of the cemetery grounds, built in 1887 when this place was established. 2 rooms, thick walls, a working fireplace, and a well out back that still pumped clean water. I'd been living there for 8 months as part of my employment agreement. Free housing in exchange for round-the-clock availability. Made sense when I took the job. I had nowhere else to go, and the isolation seemed peaceful. Now that isolation seemed like something else entirely. I walked back through the grounds, past the sections I'd memorized over the last 3 years. The colonial area with its weathered slate markers. The military section with its precise rows of white stones. The garden of reflection where families paid extra for decorative statuary and pond access. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning when I'd started my rounds. Quiet. Still. The only movement was leaves tumbling across the grass, and the only sound was the wind moving through the old oak trees that marked the property boundaries. 50 acres, iron fencing on all sides, 8 feet tall with decorative spikes along the top. 3 gates, main entrance at the front, service entrance on the east side, residential access at the back where Marcus had fled. All of them could be locked with chains I had keys for. The cottage sat on a small rise near the center of the property. From the front window, I had sight lines to most of the cemetery. The back window overlooked the old section, where graves dated back to the 1800s, and the stones were tilted at drunken angles, half swallowed by earth and time. I went inside and turned on the television. Every channel was showing the same footage from different angles. Downtown had collapsed into chaos. The news anchors were trying to maintain professionalism, but you could hear the crack in their voices. They kept using words like outbreak and aggressive behavior and unexplained illness, but the footage showed something simpler and worse. It showed people attacking other people, not fighting, not rioting, attacking, with teeth and hands, and a complete absence of anything resembling normal human hesitation. And the people who got attacked? They stopped moving for a while, then they started moving again. Wrong. I watched a camera crew get overrun on live television, watched the feed cut out, watched the anchors in the studio realize what they'd just broadcast. The woman started crying. The man told everyone to stay calm, to lock their doors, to wait for official instructions. Then the feed cut out entirely, replaced by a blue screen with a scrolling emergency message. I turned off the television. My hands were shaking. Not because I was scared yet, the fear would come later when I had time to process, but because my body understood something my mind was still resisting. Everything had changed. Everything. I did what made sense in the moment. I locked the cottage door. Both doors, front and back. I closed all the curtains except for small gaps I could see through. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and tried to think. The cottage wasn't stocked for a crisis. I had food for maybe 4 days. Canned soup, bread that would go stale quickly, peanut butter, instant meals, coffee. The well provided water, so that was covered. Heat, too. The fireplace worked, and I had a cord of wood stacked against the north wall outside. For tools, I had everything from the maintenance shed: shovels, pickaxes, loppers, a scythe I'd been meaning to sharpen, hedge trimmers, a push mower, hand tools, work gloves, respirator masks from the mausoleum restoration project last year, and the fence, that 8-foot iron fence that surrounded the entire property. I'd complained about it just last month when I had to repaint sections. Too much surface area. Too many ornamental details that caught rust. Now I mentally traced the perimeter, looking for weaknesses. The gates were the obvious problem. The fence itself was solid, original construction, real ironwork, sunk in concrete foundations. But the gates were held by chains and locks that someone could break if they really wanted to, or something. I stood up and looked out the front window again. The smoke downtown had spread. The sirens had mostly stopped. It was early afternoon, and the sun made everything look normal and golden and completely wrong. That's when I saw the first one enter the cemetery. She came through the main gate. I'd forgotten to lock it after Marcus ran, walking with a stiff, uneven gait that reminded me of Marcus's grandfather at the funeral last year. Stroke victim. One side not cooperating with the other. But this woman was young, maybe 30, wearing what used to be a business suit. Used to be, because now it was shredded down one side and soaked with something dark that wasn't dirt. She wandered between headstones with no apparent direction, not reading names, not mourning, just moving. Every few seconds her head would jerk to one side like she heard something, then jerk back. Her mouth hung open. Even from 200 feet away, I could see that her eyes weren't right. They had the same quality as the dead fish I'd seen once on a beach trip: flat, clouded, reflecting light but not processing it. I watched her zigzag through the colonial section, bump into a gravestone, correct course, continue on. She was heading roughly toward the cottage, but not with any purpose, just drifting. Behind her, 3 more figures appeared at the gate, then 2 more. They spread out across the grounds like water finding its level, moving slow, never stopping. I counted 11 before I stopped counting. More kept coming. Asterisk if you've ever felt the exact moment your safe place became a trap. You know the feeling that hit me right then. If this story hooks you the way it hooked me to my survival, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next determined whether I'd live or become one of them. Asterisk's 48 hours were about securing the perimeter. I couldn't do anything about the main gate. Too exposed, too many of them wandering near it, but I could handle the other two. I waited until dusk when the temperature dropped and the infected seemed to slow down. Then I made my move to the service gate. Bolt cutters from the shed, heavy chain from the storage container, padlocks I'd bought with my own money after tools kept disappearing last year. The service gate sat next to a large maintenance building, where we stored the riding mower, industrial equipment, and bulk supplies. I hadn't been inside since last week. Now I approached it like I was diffusing a device, every footstep measured, watching the spaces between mausoleums where the infected might be standing. Just standing. That's what unnerved me most. They didn't rest, didn't sit. When they weren't moving, they just stood there swaying slightly, like broken animatronics running on backup power. I could see two of them in the Garden of Reflection, maybe 60 feet away. One man in torn maintenance overalls, not cemetery maintenance, something else, maybe industrial. One younger guy in athletic gear. They stood on opposite sides of the ornamental pond, not looking at each other, not looking at anything. The maintenance overall one had a chunk missing from his shoulder. The athletic one was intact except for his hands, which were shredded to bone in places. I moved quietly. Every sound felt amplified. The chain rattled when I pulled it from my bag, and both heads snapped toward me in perfect synchronization. I froze. They stared in my direction, not at me exactly, but toward the sound. After 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, they lost interest and went back to their swaying standstill. I wrapped the chain through the gate bars and the fence post, working quickly, fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Looped it 3 times, fed the padlock through, clicked it shut. The sound echoed across the cemetery like a gunshot. This time, 4 of them turned. The 2 from the pond plus 2 others I hadn't seen lurking near the equipment building. They started moving toward me, not running, not rushing. Just that awful, inevitable walking. The kind you can't reason with or negotiate with because there's nothing behind their eyes that understands reasoning or negotiation. I've seen that look once before, on a dog that got hit by a car and didn't die right away. Pure stimulus response. No thought, no hesitation, just movement towards something that triggered them. I backed away slowly, remembering every nature documentary I'd ever seen about not running from predators. Except these weren't predators. Predators killed for food, for territory, for purpose. These things killed because killing was the only command their broken brains still received. 20 feet. They kept coming. 30 feet. Still coming. I passed the equipment building and risked a faster pace, cutting between 2 old mausoleums that created a narrow passage. The infected didn't navigate obstacles well. I'd noticed that already. They hit things head-on, got stuck on corners, struggled with anything that required fine motor control. The narrow passage bought me time. I heard them behind me, bodies scraping against stone, that horrible wet-breathing sound they all made. I broke into a run once I cleared the mausoleums, sprinting back toward the cottage. My lungs burned. My legs felt disconnected from my body. I didn't look back until I hit the cottage door, key already in my hand, and threw myself inside. Slammed it shut, threw the deadbolt, collapsed against the wood, gasping. Through the front window, I watched them emerge from between the mausoleums. 4 became 6. 6 became 8. They congregated near where I'd been standing, milling around like they'd forgotten what they were chasing. One of them, the athletic guy, turned in a complete circle 3 times, then wandered off toward the Victorian section. The others followed eventually, spreading back out across the grounds. I sat on the floor until my breathing normalized, until the shaking in my hands stopped, until I could think clearly enough to form a plan. One gate secured, two to go. The back gate would have to wait. Too risky in the dark, and I needed to see what I was dealing with. Instead, I spent the evening cataloging everything in the cottage. Every can of food, every tool, every potential resource. I found things I'd forgotten I had: a camping lantern, waterproof matches, a first aid kit from my brief attempt at hiking last spring, freeze-dried camping meals, iodine tablets, a hand crank emergency radio. The radio still worked. I cranked it for 5 minutes, then tuned through static until I found a broadcast, not a local station, something from further out, maybe military, maybe government. The voice was male, calm, reading from a script, maintained order in designated safe zones. Civilians are advised to remain indoors. Do not attempt to travel. Do not approach infected individuals. Infection occurs through fluid transfer, primarily bites or blood contact. Incubation period ranges from minutes to hours depending on severity of exposure. Infected individuals display aggression, loss of cognitive function, and eventual motor degradation. There is no cure. There is no treatment. Avoid contact, conserve resources, wait for official rescue operations. This message will repeat. It repeated. I listened to it 3 more times, writing down the key details. Then I turned it off to save the mechanics. No cure, no treatment. Wait for rescue. I looked around the cottage. Stone walls, solid door, working well. Fireplace, 50 acres of fenced cemetery. Tools, high ground, sight lines. And outside, an unknown number of infected wandering between graves, bumping into headstones, standing motionless for hours, then suddenly moving again. Wait for rescue. Sure. How long? Days? Weeks? The radio voice didn't say. The emergency broadcast just kept repeating the same information like a mantra. Stay inside, avoid contact, wait. I made a decision that night that probably saved my life. I wasn't going to just wait. I was going to survive, actively, deliberately, using everything this place offered. Starting with the fence. Day 3, I woke up to fog. Thick stuff that rolled in from the valley and turned the cemetery into something from an old photograph. Visibility maybe 30 feet. I could barely see the nearest headstones from the cottage window, and everything beyond that disappeared into gray nothing. The infected were out there somewhere, invisible, wandering. I used the fog as cover, grabbed the bolt cutters, the chains, the locks. Grabbed a pickaxe too, because if something came at me through the fog, I wanted reach and impact. Then I headed for the back gate, the one Marcus had fled through, the one that led into the residential neighborhoods. The fog muffled sound and distance. I nearly walked into one of them 20 feet from the cottage. Just a shape in the gray standing between graves. I froze. It swayed. I could hear the wet, labored breathing. Could smell something rotten and chemical, like meat left in a hot car. The shape didn't turn toward me. After a moment, I stepped carefully to the side, giving it a wide berth. It never moved. The back gate took longer because the chain had rusted and I needed to cut through old links before wrapping new ones. Every scrape of metal on metal sounded impossibly loud in the fog. Every few seconds I'd stop, listen, scan the gray. Shapes moved out there. Could have been infected. Could have been fog playing tricks. I didn't wait to find out. I worked fast, wrapped the chain tight, snapped the padlock shut, and retreated before the fog could betray me. 3 gates secured. The cemetery was now a closed system. Nothing else getting in. But also, and I thought about this for a long time, nothing getting out, including me. The fog cleared by noon, burned off by spring sunshine that made everything look peaceful and wrong. I counted the infected from the cottage window. 17 visible at any given time, but they moved enough that I couldn't get an accurate total. maybe 20, maybe 30. They congregated in certain areas. The Garden of Reflection seemed popular, maybe because of the open space, or the water feature, or some stimulus I couldn't identify. Others wandered the old section where the graves were neglected and overgrown. A few just stood motionless near mausoleums, like they were waiting for something. I made notes, started tracking patterns. The maintenance overall guy always ended up near the western fence by evening. The athletic guy circled the Victorian section in a loop that took about 2 hours to complete. A woman in a torn dress stayed almost exclusively in the military section, weaving between identical white stones. They didn't interact with each other, didn't acknowledge each other, and just recalibrate, adjust course, continue on. No aggression between them, just parallel existence. But noise attracted them. I tested it on day 4, dropped a shovel on stone from inside the cottage, watched through the window as heads snapped toward the sound from across the cemetery. They started moving toward it immediately, converging from different directions like iron filings toward a magnet. It took them 20 minutes to reach the cottage. They milled around outside for another hour before wandering off, so noise equals danger. I filed that information away. Day 5, I started thinking about food. My supplies would last maybe a week more if I rationed carefully. The emergency broadcast kept saying help was coming, but it had said that for 5 days straight without change, without update. The script never varied, which meant either nobody was updating it or nobody could. I thought about Marcus, about the way he'd run, about how I'd never heard from him again, never seen him again. The residential neighborhoods beyond the back gate had gone quiet after the first 2 days. No more sirens, no more screams, just silence. The kind of silence that means something final. The cemetery had resources. I just needed to think differently. The Garden of Reflection had raised beds where volunteers had planted decorative flowers, soil, space, sunlight. I could plant food. The maintenance building had bags of topsoil, fertilizer, seed packets for grass that could be repurposed. I'd never gardened before, but I'd watched enough survival content online to know the basics. Then there was the mausoleum restoration project. We'd been repairing the old crypt when the outbreak hit, and the contractor had left supplies: bottled water, energy drinks, protein bars, instant meals. I'd forgotten about it because the mausoleum sat at the far edge of the property, deep in the old section where the infected seemed to cluster. I spent day 6 planning a route. The mausoleum sat 300 yards from the cottage, through uneven terrain studded with headstones, monuments, and crypts. Direct line was impossible. Too many obstacles, too many sightline breaks where infected could be hiding. I needed a path that kept me visible, gave me escape routes, and minimized choke points. I traced it on paper using a cemetery map from the office. Cottage to the Victorian section, following the paved path. Victorian section to the military area, cutting between rows. Military area to the old section, using the tree line for concealment. Then a final sprint across open ground to the mausoleum. 300 yards, maybe 10 minutes moving cautiously. 5 if I ran, but I'd be exposed, vulnerable, and if they caught me in the open, I had no backup plan. I decided to do it at dawn. Lowest infected activity based on my observations. They slowed down in the cold early morning, moved less, stood motionless for longer periods. I'd have maybe a 2-hour window before the sun warmed them up and they started wandering again. That night, I barely slept. Kept playing the route through my head, visualizing each turn, each landmark. Kept thinking about what would happen if I failed, if they cornered me, if I tripped and twisted an ankle. The cottage would be here, locked and safe, and I'd be out there bleeding and screaming while they closed in. But I was also thinking about those protein bars, that water, those supplies, about the fact that my last can of soup was gone, and I'd been eating plain peanut butter for 2 days. Dawn came gray and cold. I dressed in layers, dark colors, nothing that would catch on obstacles. work gloves, boots. I grabbed the pickaxe for its reach, and the bolt cutters in case I needed to cut through something. Put bottles in my backpack for water. Left the cottage door unlocked so I could get back in fast. Then I stepped outside for the first time in 3 days and started moving. The Victorian section was clear, just empty paths winding between ornate monuments. My breath fogged in the cold air. Every sound was amplified. The crunch of gravel under boots, the distant call of a bird, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I moved from monument to monument, using them as cover, scanning constantly. Military section, 2 infected visible, both standing motionless near the flagpole. I gave them a wide berth, cutting through rows of identical white stones. The symmetry was disorienting. Everything looked the same. I kept my eyes on the tree line, using it as a navigation reference. Old section, heavier vegetation, older stones, more places to hide. More places for them to hide too. I slowed down, moving carefully, pickaxe ready. Saw one standing between 2 tilted headstones, its back to me. Saw another lying on the ground, actually lying down, which I hadn't seen before. Was it dead? Could they die again? I didn't stop to check. The mausoleum appeared through the trees. Stone structure, ornate door, small windows near the roof. The contractor's truck was still parked beside it, covered in pollen. I approached slowly, checking every angle. The door stood ajar. Had it been opened before? I couldn't remember. I pushed it wider with the pickaxe handle. The inside was dark, musty, smelling of old stone and damp. Supply crates stacked against one wall. Tarps covering equipment. And standing in the far corner, absolutely motionless, a man in contractor gear. He didn't move when the door opened, didn't react to the light, just stood there facing the wall, swaying almost imperceptibly. His arms hung at his sides, his head tilted at an angle that didn't look voluntary. I could see bite marks on his neck, black and crusted. I backed out slowly. He still didn't turn. I pulled the door shut as quietly as possible and moved to the side, heart hammering, pressed against the cold stone wall of the mausoleum and tried to think. The supplies were in there, 20 feet from the door, but so was he, and if I made noise gathering supplies, he'd react. They always reacted to noise. I looked at the pickaxe in my hands, looked at the door, thought about what I'd have to do. I'd never killed anything bigger than a spider before, never hurt anyone. The worst fight I'd ever been in was 8th grade, and I'd lost. But this wasn't a person anymore. The radio had been clear. Loss of cognitive function, no treatment, no cure. This was something else. Something that used to be a contractor named probably Dave or Mike or something normal. Something that had a family somewhere, a house, a favorite meal, a whole life before. Now it was just a thing in the dark that would kill me if given the chance. I opened the door again, stepped inside. The contractor thing still faced the wall. I moved toward the supply crates, each step careful and silent. 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet. Almost there. I reached for the nearest crate. My boot scraped stone. Just a small sound. A whisper. But his head snapped around with terrible speed, and those flat, dead eyes locked onto me, and he lunged. I swung the pickaxe without thinking. Survival instinct. The pointed end caught him in the chest and stopped his momentum but didn't drop him. He grabbed the handle, yanking me forward. His mouth opened, that awful breathing sound up close like lungs full of fluid, and his teeth snapped at air 6 inches from my face. I jerked backward, ripping the pickaxe free. He stumbled but didn't fall, came at me again. This time I aimed for the head. Connected with the flat side of the pick, a sound like a hammer on meat, and he went down hard, didn't get up. I stood there breathing in ragged gasps, pickaxe raised, waiting for him to move. He didn't. After a minute I checked. No breathing, no movement, just a body that had stopped working. I felt nothing. That scared me more than the attack. Shouldn't I feel something? Horror, guilt, relief? But there was just a numb, blank space where emotions should have been, and a practical voice in my head saying, "Grab the supplies and get out." I loaded my backpack with protein bars, water bottles, energy drinks, grabbed a case of instant meals, found a box of emergency candles, a camping stove with fuel, more first aid supplies. Took everything I could carry. The contractor's body lay between me and the door. I stepped over it, still felt nothing. Outside, the sun had risen higher. The cemetery was waking up. I could see infected wandering in the distance, more than before. My 2-hour window was closing. I headed back, following the same route in reverse, moving faster now, less cautious. The weight of the supplies dug into my shoulders. Sweat soaked through my layers despite the cold. Made it to the military section. Made it to Victorian. The cottage appeared ahead. Door still unlocked, safety 60 feet away. 40 feet. 20. Something grabbed my backpack from behind. I spun, nearly fell. The woman in the torn dress, the one who circled the military section. She'd followed me. Her hands clutched the fabric of my pack, pulling, her mouth opening and closing. I twisted, trying to break free. She held on. Other shapes were moving toward us now, attracted by the commotion. I shrugged out of the backpack straps, let her have it. She stumbled backward with the weight, confused, and I bolted for the cottage. Slammed inside, through the deadbolt. Collapsed against the door, listening to them congregate outside. Listening to them paw at the door, scrape at the windows, make those wet breathing sounds. I'd lost half the supplies, but I'd survived, and I'd learned something important. I could kill them if I had to. The knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone, cold, hard, necessary. Outside, something dragged my backpack across gravel. Supplies scattered. They didn't eat the protein bars or drink the water. They just knocked everything around, stepped on it, moved on. Eventually, they wandered away. The backpack lay torn in the grass, 20 feet from my door. The supplies lay scattered further out. I'd have to get them later, when it was safe, when I could think clearly again. For now, I had what I'd carried in my pockets: 3 protein bars, 2 bottles of water, a box of emergency candles. Enough for a few more days. I sat in the cottage and ate 1 protein bar slowly, making it last. Through the window, I watched the infected resume their wandering, watched them return to their patterns, their loops, their standing. The maintenance overall guy headed west. The athletic guy circled Victorian. Everything back to the new normal. Except I'd changed. Something had shifted. I'd killed one of them. I'd lost supplies and survived anyway. I'd proven I could move through the cemetery, could take risks, could adapt. The cottage wasn't just my prison anymore. The cemetery wasn't just my trap. It was my territory, my resource, my survival ground, and I was going to learn how to use it. Week 2 started with rain. Not a gentle spring drizzle, but heavy sheets that turned the cemetery paths into rivers and made the old section a mud pit. The infected didn't care. They wandered through it like machines, clothes plastered to bodies, hair hanging in wet ropes. The rain didn't slow them down or drive them to seek shelter. They just walked, stood, walked some more. I used the rain to my advantage. Sound masking, visibility reduction. I went out in full rain gear and recovered what remained of my scattered supplies. The protein bars were ruined, wrappers torn open by random grabbing, but the water bottles were intact, the emergency candles too. I gathered them quickly, working in the downpour, watching shapes move through the gray curtain of rain around me. One came within 10 feet, just appeared out of the rain, a man in business clothes, with half his face missing. I froze in a crouch, hand on the pickaxe. He walked right past me, didn't see me, didn't smell me. Whatever senses they had left, they were dulled by rain and cold. I filed that information away. Weather is an advantage. Back in the cottage, I stripped out of wet clothes and stood by the fireplace until feeling returned to my fingers. The supplies I'd recovered weren't enough. 3 days, maybe 4, with strict rationing. I needed a real plan, needed to think beyond the next meal. The garden idea kept circling back. The garden of reflection had 6 raised beds, each one about 4 feet by 8 feet. Good soil, drainage, sun exposure. They'd been planted with decorative flowers, roses, irises, ornamental grasses. Pretty, but useless. I needed calories, vegetables, something that would grow fast. The maintenance building had seed packets. I'd seen them last year when I inventoried supplies. Grass seed mostly, for patching bare spots, but also some wildflower mix for memorial services. Not food. But the contractor's truck might have something. People who work outdoors sometimes keep emergency supplies. And there was a garden center 2 miles down the road. Before the outbreak, I'd driven past it every day on my way to work. Big greenhouse, rows of plants, seed displays. 2 miles might as well be 200 now. But the truck was right here. I waited until the rain stopped and evening approached. The infected slowed down at dusk, their movements becoming more erratic and sluggish. I'd started thinking of it as their low power mode. Still dangerous, still active, but less responsive. I grabbed a flashlight, the pickaxe, and a screwdriver for prying open the truck's toolbox. The mausoleum area was clearer than before. The contractor's body was gone from inside. I didn't want to think about what that meant, but the supplies I hadn't taken were still there. I made a mental note to come back for them later. First, the truck. It sat beside the mausoleum covered in pollen and leaves. Both doors locked. I jimmied the passenger side with the screwdriver until the old lock popped. The inside smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes. Fast food wrappers littered the floor. A jacket hung on the back of the driver's seat. I checked the glove box first. Registration, insurance papers, a handgun with no ammunition, a pocket knife. I took the knife. Behind the seat, I found a toolbox. Inside, wrenches, screwdrivers, electrical tape, wire cutters, a measuring tape. Useful, but not food. The center console had nothing but change and receipts. I was about to give up when I checked under the passenger seat and felt a plastic bag. Inside, 3 protein bars, a bag of beef jerky, and a small Ziploc with seeds. Actual vegetable seeds. Tomato, cucumber, squash, beans. I could have kissed that dead contractor. Instead, I pocketed everything and checked the truck bed, empty except for construction debris and a coil of rope. I took the rope too. 50 feet of it, strong nylon. Rope had infinite uses in survival situations. Movement caught my eye. 3 infected emerging from the tree line, drawn by the flashlight beam I'd stupidly left on. I killed the light and crouched behind the truck. They moved toward where I'd been, their paths converging. In the twilight, they looked almost human. Almost. Until you saw the way they moved, the way they ignored obstacles, the absolute absence of self-preservation. They reached the truck and began circling it. One scraped hands across the hood, leaving smears. Another pressed against the driver's side window, face squashed against glass. The third just stood there, swaying. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, counting seconds. After 5 minutes, an eternity, they lost interest and wandered apart. I waited another 10 minutes before moving, slow, careful, back toward the cottage. The seeds felt like treasure in my pocket. With those, I could grow food, real food, enough to last months instead of days. But first, I needed to clear the garden of reflection. Day 15, I made my first real weapon. The pickaxe worked but was clumsy, required too much wind-up, too much space. I needed something faster, lighter, more precise. In the maintenance shed, I found what I needed. A hedge trimmer handle, strong fiberglass with good grip. a reciprocating saw blade, 9 inches long with aggressive teeth, electrical tape, zip ties. 2 hours of work, and I had a makeshift machete. Not pretty, but functional. I tested it on a tree branch. Clean cut. I also modified a push mower, removing the blade assembly and sharpening it separately. Mounted it on a long pole from the fence repair supplies. Now I had a blade on a 6-foot staff, distance weapon, kept them away from me. The irony wasn't lost. Tools meant for maintaining a cemetery, now repurposed for surviving in one. Day 16, I cleared the Garden of Reflection. Started at dawn when they were slowest. 4 infected were in the area, including the athletic guy who I'd started calling Runner because he moved faster than the others. Not running exactly, but a kind of aggressive shuffle that closed distance quickly. I approached with the pole blade, the machete on my belt, and a plan. Make noise to draw them toward me, then lead them away from the garden. Simple. Stupid simple. Which is probably why it almost got me killed. I banged the pole against a metal bench. Every head in visual range snapped toward the sound. Runner came first, that awful shuffle sprint, arms reaching. I backed up, keeping distance, letting him follow. Behind him, 3 others converged. Behind them, shapes emerged from areas I hadn't checked. 7, 9, 12. Too many. I'd miscalculated. I turned and ran toward the Victorian section, where tall monuments created obstacles. They followed, a ragged procession of bodies that used to be people. I wove between monuments, gained distance, cut left toward a mausoleum, circled behind it, pressed against cold stone and waited. They lost me. I watched them mill around the Victorian section, confused, bumping into monuments. Gradually they dispersed, wandering back to their territories. All except Runner, who lingered, head swiveling, like some part of his broken brain remembered I was there somewhere. I waited him out, 30 minutes of absolute stillness while he paced. Eventually he moved on. I took a different route back to the garden, circling wide, checking constantly. The garden was clear now. The raised beds sat undisturbed in morning light. I got to work, ripped out the decorative plants, tossed them aside, turned the soil with a hand trowel from the shed, mixed in fresh topsoil and fertilizer from the maintenance building. My hands ached. Blisters formed and popped and reformed. I didn't stop. By noon, I had 3 beds prepared, planted tomato seeds in one, beans in another, squash in the third, watered them from the pond using a bucket. The whole time, I kept the pole blade within reach, and my eyes on the surrounding cemetery. Nothing approached. The infected had returned to their patterns, and their patterns didn't include the garden anymore. I planted cucumbers in the 4th bed the next day, left the last 2 beds for later. I was out of seeds and didn't want to waste soil. The planted beds looked absurd. Neat rows of tilled earth in the middle of a memorial garden, surrounded by scattered rose bushes and ornamental grasses I'd torn out. Beyond that, headstones and wandering infected. The juxtaposition was surreal, but it was progress. Real, tangible progress. In 2 months, those seeds would be food. In 3 months, I'd have enough vegetables to extend my supplies significantly, assuming nothing trampled them, assuming the infected didn't randomly wander through and destroy everything, assuming I survived that long. Big assumptions, but I had to start somewhere. Asking, probably wondering how I dealt with the psychological weight of living among graves and the undead. Trust me, it gets darker before it gets lighter. If you're invested in this survival story, drop a comment telling me what you do in this situation, and smash that subscribe button, because the next phase tested more than just my survival skills. Week 3, I started mapping the cemetery in detail. Not just the layout, I already knew that, but the infected patterns, where they congregated, where they wandered, their individual loops and territories. I used a cemetery map and marked it up with colored pencils from the office supplies. Red for high activity areas, yellow for moderate, green for relatively clear. The Garden of Reflection was green now. The old section stayed red, too many of them clustered there among the tilted headstones and overgrown vegetation. Victorian section was yellow, mostly because of runner. Military section fluctuated between yellow and green depending on time of day. I gave them all names, not because I was lonely, though I was, but because tracking the woman in the torn dress was easier than infected individual number 4, runner, was obvious. Maintenance Mike wore those industrial overalls. Business Face was the guy missing half his face. Dress Lady circled the military section. Slouch had a tilted posture like his spine had fused wrong. Naming them made them easier to predict. Runner always moved clockwise through Victorian. Business Face preferred the paths rarely cut across grass. Dress Lady stopped at every flagpole, standing motionless for exactly 7 minutes before moving on. I timed it. 7 minutes, every time. Patterns meant predictability. Predictability meant safety. I started planning my movements around their patterns, treating the cemetery like a puzzle with moving pieces. If Runner was in Victorian East, I could move through Victorian West. If Business Face was on the main path, I could cut through the sections. If Dress Lady was at a flagpole, I had 7 minutes to cross military uncontested. It worked. I moved more freely, gathered more supplies, made multiple trips to the maintenance building, found canned goods I'd forgotten about in the break room, found a camping tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove. Someone, probably Marcus, had been planning a weekend trip. Their loss, my gain. I also found Marcus's log. He'd been keeping notes about the cemetery operations, maintenance schedules, problem areas. The last entry was dated the day he ran. Something wrong downtown. Police everywhere. Cole thinks I'm crazy, but I'm getting out while I can. He'd known, or suspected, or panicked early. Either way, he'd made his choice, and I'd made mine. I wondered if he survived, wondered if anyone out there survived. The emergency radio still broadcast the same message on loop. Shelter in place, avoid contact, wait for rescue. But no updates, no news, no evidence that anyone was actually coordinating anything. Day 22, the rain came back. 3 days of steady downpour that turned the cemetery into a swamp. The infected moved through it, unbothered, their clothes rotting off their bodies. I watched from the cottage window as Business Face's shirt disintegrated completely, leaving him bare-chested and covered in bite marks I hadn't seen before. Dozens of them. He'd been attacked by multiple infected before turning. The rain made me think about disease, about contamination. The cemetery had no sewage system. The cottage used a septic tank that I couldn't maintain. Eventually, it would fail. The well water was clean now, but what about runoff from the infected? They left fluids everywhere, black and viscous. Could that contaminate groundwater? I had no idea. No way to test it. I started boiling all drinking water. Better safe than infected. The camping stove made it easy, and I had enough fuel for months. But that was another resource with a timer on it. Fuel would run out. Food would run out. Everything had a countdown, except the garden. The garden was renewable. I checked it daily during the rain, slogging through mud with the pole blade. The seeds hadn't sprouted yet, too early, but the soil looked good. No erosion, no flooding. The raised beds did their job. On day 25, I saw the first sprouts, tiny green shoots pushing through soil in the bean bed. I crouched there in the rain, staring at them, and felt something crack in my chest. Relief, hope, proof that something could still grow in this place of death. I almost cried, caught myself, stood up, scanned for infected, moved on. Emotions were dangerous. They made you careless, made you forget that the woman in the torn dress was 30 feet away, standing motionless in the rain, and crying over bean sprouts was a good way to die. But I went back to the cottage and allowed myself 5 minutes. 5 minutes of sitting on the floor, back against the wall, processing the fact that I was still alive, still functional, still capable of growing things. Then I locked it away and focused on the next problem. Water storage. I needed to collect rainwater. The well was fine for now, but diversification was survival. I found plastic barrels in the maintenance building, set them under the cottage's downspouts. Within a day, they were full. I covered them with screen mesh from the window repair supplies to keep debris out. Now I had backup water. Another small victory. Week 5, the garden was growing. Beans climbed improvised trellises I made from bamboo stakes. Tomato plants reached 6 inches, leaves spreading. Squash vines sprawled across their bed. Cucumbers lagged behind but showed promise. I tended them daily, pulling weeds, checking soil moisture, watching for pests. The infected ignored the garden completely. They wandered near it, sometimes through it, but never damaged the plants. It was like they couldn't see them, or didn't register them as significant. I watched Runner walk directly past a tomato plant, close enough to brush it with his leg, and he never looked down. Whatever was left of their brains, it didn't process plants. Only movement, only sound, only potential prey. I used that, started wearing green when I moved through the cemetery. Dark green work clothes that blended with vegetation, moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding sudden motions. It worked. I got within 5 feet of maintenance Mike once, hidden behind an overgrown hedge, and he never detected me, just stood there swaying, staring at nothing while I crept past. Stealth became my primary defense. Fighting was last resort. Every confrontation risked injury, infection, death. Better to avoid, to slip past, to let them wander while I moved through gaps in their patterns. I was becoming something new. Not the cemetery groundskeeper who'd complained about paperwork and wrong measurements. That person was gone, buried somewhere between the first infected and the first bean sprout. Now I was something else, a survivor, a scavenger, a ghost moving through a graveyard full of ghosts. Day 40, I ran out of protein bars, ate the last one for breakfast and stared at my remaining supplies. 2 cans of soup, a half jar of peanut butter, instant oatmeal packets, rice, dried beans that needed cooking. Enough for maybe 2 weeks if I stretched it. The garden wouldn't produce for another month at minimum. I needed more food, real food, which meant venturing beyond the cottage's immediate area, meant taking risks. The contractor's truck still had a full tank of gas. I'd checked. The keys were in the ignition, but the truck was parked deep in the old section surrounded by infected, and driving would mean opening the cemetery gates, potentially letting them out, or letting more in. No. The truck was a last resort. Instead, I'd explore the maintenance building more thoroughly. 3,000 square feet of storage, most of it packed with equipment and supplies I'd never inventoried properly. There had to be something. I went at dawn with both weapons and a backpack. The building sat next to the service gate, a squat concrete structure with roll-up doors and high windows. I'd secured it weeks ago, but hadn't fully searched it. Too risky, too exposed. Now I had no choice. The infected in the area were minimal, 3 visible, all distant. I unlocked the side door and slipped inside. The interior was dark, musty, smelling of gasoline and fertilizer. I clicked on my flashlight. Rows of industrial shelving filled the space. Riding mowers, push mowers, edgers blowers, pallets of topsoil and mulch, barrels of fertilizer, tool racks, a small office in the corner. I checked the office first. Desk, filing cabinet, mini fridge. The fridge still had power. The building ran on the same grid as the cottage, fed by solar panels the cemetery had installed 2 years ago. Inside the fridge, a moldy sandwich, 3 energy drinks, a 6-pack of bottled water. I took the drinks and water. The desk drawers held office supplies, invoices, Maintenance logs. Nothing useful, but the filing cabinet had a bottom drawer marked emergency supplies. Inside, a first aid kit, emergency blankets, road flares, and 2 boxes of military-grade MREs. Meals ready to eat. 36 meals total. I actually laughed. Standing in that dark office surrounded by the smell of decay and gasoline, holding boxes of food with 5-year shelf lives. 36 meals, at 1 per day. That was over a month. Combined with my remaining supplies and the garden's eventual harvest, I could survive into summer, maybe beyond. I loaded the MREs into my backpack carefully. They were heavy, the pack bulging. I grabbed the emergency blankets too, thin mylar sheets that reflected heat, good for signaling or insulation. The road flares went into my pocket. Fire was always useful. A sound outside. Scraping. I killed the flashlight and moved to the door's small window. Business Face was dragging himself along the building's exterior wall, one leg not working properly. He'd degraded since I last saw him. His movements were more erratic, less coordinated. The infection was breaking his body down from the inside. They didn't last forever. I'd noticed that. The ones who'd been infected longest showed more deterioration. Slower movements, more damage, pieces falling off. Eventually, they'd stop working entirely. The question was, how long? Weeks? Months? And would they all stop before I ran out of supplies? Business Face scraped past the door and continued along the wall. I waited until he disappeared around the corner, then slipped out and headed back to the cottage. The backpack was heavy enough that my shoulders ached by the time I arrived. I dumped the MREs on the floor and counted them again, just to be sure. 36. Real food. Calories. Protein. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like security. That night, I ate an MRE, beef stew with crackers. It was simultaneously the worst and best thing I'd ever tasted. Processed chemical, wrong texture. But hot. Filling. Real. I ate slowly, savoring every bite, and allowed myself to think about the future beyond the next meal. The garden would produce food. The MREs bought time. The cemetery was secure. I had water, shelter, weapons. I could survive here, maybe indefinitely. The thought was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. Month 2, the psychological weight started showing. I'd been alone for 60 days. 60 days of silence except for wind and groaning infected. 60 days of constant vigilance. No human contact. No conversation. No connection. I started talking to myself. Nothing crazy, just narrating actions. Thinking out loud. Okay, check the garden. Water levels look good. Beans are coming in. Tomatoes need another week. It helped. Gave me something to hold on to. Proof I was still human, still thinking, still functioning. But it also scared me. The line between talking to yourself and losing yourself was thinner than I'd thought. I found a journal in the cottage's office supplies. Started writing daily entries. Not about emotions. Those were dangerous. But about practical information. What I did. What I observed. Infected patterns. Weather. Garden progress. Survival data. If I died, maybe someone would find it. Maybe it would help them survive. Day 67. Beans ready to harvest. First real food from the garden. Runner showing degradation in left arm. Business Face hasn't moved in 3 days. Might be shutting down. Weather clear. Well water still clean. MRE count. 29 remaining. Day 70. Harvested 8 pounds of beans. Blanched and stored. Tomatoes ripening, maybe 3 more days. Dress lady broke pattern today. Wandered into old section. Possible site degradation? Maintenance mic no longer moving, collapsed near west fence. Body count of permanently stopped infected. 4. Active infected estimate. 1618. Day 75. First tomatoes harvested. Best thing I've eaten in months. Garden producing enough to supplement MREs. Squash ready next week. Need to save seeds for second planting. Radio broadcast still unchanged. No signs of rescue. Beginning to think rescue isn't coming. That last entry sat on the page like an accusation. I stared at it for a long time before closing the journal. If rescue wasn't coming, then this was permanent. This cemetery, this isolation, this existence of moving between graves and avoiding the infected and growing vegetables in memorial gardens. I could survive here indefinitely, but surviving and living weren't the same thing. The question I couldn't answer was, which one was I doing? Day 82. Something changed. I was harvesting squash when I heard an engine. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. A vehicle, somewhere beyond the cemetery boundaries. I dropped the squash and ran to the western fence, the side that overlooked the residential neighborhoods. Smoke rose from 3 blocks away. Not fire smoke. Exhaust. A truck moved slowly down a street, weaving between abandoned cars. I could see figures in the truck bed, maybe 3 of them. Living people. Human beings. I grabbed the road flares from the cottage and ran back to the fence. Struck one, brilliant red flame and smoke, waved it overhead, jumping, shouting. The truck was too far away. Too much distance, too many buildings. They couldn't see me. The truck turned a corner and disappeared. The engine sound faded. I stood at the fence, road flare burning in my hand, and felt something collapse inside my chest. Hope. That's what had collapsed. The fragile, desperate hope that I wasn't alone. I let the flare burn down to nothing, then walked back to the cottage. Sat on the front step, looked out at the cemetery with its wandering infected, its overgrown graves, its gardens growing between tombstones. This was my world now. 50 acres of memorial land. 16 infected that I'd named and tracked. A cottage with stone walls and a working well. Gardens that would produce food through summer and fall. And me. Just me. Day 90. I started planning for winter. Summer was halfway over. Fall would come. Then winter. The cottage had a fireplace and I had wood. But was it enough? The infected wouldn't leave when it got cold. They'd just slow down more. Freeze, maybe. But the threat remained. I needed winter supplies. Heavy clothes. More firewood. Insulation. Backup heat sources. The maintenance building had winter equipment. Snow blowers. Ice melt. Emergency generators. I inventoried all of it. Moved what I could to the cottage. The generator was too heavy to move alone, but I got it running, tested it, made sure it worked. 15 gallons of fuel in jerry cans, enough to power the cottage for weeks if the solar panels failed. I reinforced the cottage door with lumber from the equipment building, added a second lock, boarded up one window completely, the back one that overlooked the old section. Less light, but more security. The front window got interior shutters I could close if needed. The place was becoming a fortress. Small, cramped, but secure. Mine. The garden continued producing. I harvested constantly blanched vegetables and dried them on screens in the sun. No refrigeration, so preservation was critical. Dried tomatoes, dried squash, dried beans. They'd last months if stored properly. I used glass jars from the maintenance building's break room, sealed them tight, stored them in the coolest part of the cottage. By day 100, I had enough preserved food to last through winter even if the garden failed completely. Combined with the remaining MREs and my scavenged supplies, I could survive until spring. Maybe longer. I was going to make it. The realization hit me while I was working the garden, pulling weeds from around cucumber plants. I was actually going to survive this, 100 days in, and I was still alive, still functional, still capable. The cottage was secure. The cemetery was mapped. The infected were predictable. I had food, water, weapons, shelter. I'd done it, against impossible odds. Against every advantage the outbreak had, I'd carved out survival in a cemetery. Asterisk, if you're still with me at day 100, you understand this isn't just about surviving zombies. It's about surviving isolation, fear, and the person you become when civilization ends. Share this story with someone who loves survival tales, because what happens next introduces a variable I never planned for: other people. Asterisk, day 107. I heard voices, human voices, multiple people, talking beyond the western fence. I grabbed the binoculars from the cottage and moved to the fence line carefully, stayed behind the tree line where I couldn't be easily seen. 5 people, 4 men and what looked like a teenager, though from distance I couldn't be certain. They moved through the residential neighborhood methodically, checking houses, loading supplies into a shopping cart they pushed between them. All carried weapons: baseball bats, a crowbar, what looked like a hunting rifle. They were organized, purposeful, alive. I watched them for 20 minutes. They moved with practiced efficiency, communicating through hand signals as much as words. Survivors. Real survivors, not just someone fleeing in a truck. A group that had lasted over 3 months. I should have called out, should have signaled them. But something stopped me. Maybe caution. Maybe the 100 days of isolation had changed me more than I realized. Maybe I'd gotten used to the silence, the predictability, the absence of human complications. Or maybe I just didn't trust that they were safe, that they wouldn't see my supplies, my security, my survival setup and decide they needed it more than I did. I let them pass, watched them disappear into the neighborhood. Didn't signal, didn't call out, just observed and withdrew back to the cottage. Told myself I'd made the smart choice, the safe choice. But that night, lying in my sleeping bag, I questioned it. Was I surviving or hiding? Was security the same as isolation? At what point did the survivor become the thing he was surviving against? A lone, territorial, defensive. I didn't have answers, just questions that kept me awake until dawn. The next day they came back. Same group, different route, moving through the streets adjacent to the cemetery. This time they stopped near the western fence. One of them, tall, bearded, carrying the rifle pointed at the cemetery, said something I couldn't hear from the cottage. The others gathered around, looking. They were discussing it, evaluating it, the cemetery as a potential resource or refuge. I watched through the binoculars, heart pounding. Would they try to enter? Would they climb the fence? What would I do if they did? After 5 minutes, they moved on. The bearded one shook his head, gestured toward the cemetery's gates, said something that made the others laugh. Not cruel laughter, just tired humor. Then they continued down the street, pushing their cart, and disappeared around a corner. I exhaled, realized I'd been holding my breath. My hands were shaking from fear, relief. I wasn't sure anymore. That night, I made a decision. I'd watched them twice now. They seemed organized, capable, not immediately threatening. If they returned, if they approached the cemetery again, I'd make contact, cautiously. But I'd try. Because 100 days alone had taught me something. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human. And humans needed other humans, even if that need scared the hell out of me. Day 112, they returned. All 5 of them, this time carrying what looked like climbing equipment. They approached the western fence directly, clearly intending to enter the cemetery. I watched from the tree line, the machete on my belt, the pole blade in hand. The bearded one with the rifle examined the fence, ran his hands along the iron bars, looked up at the spikes on top, shook his head, too difficult to climb safely. They walked along the fence line, searching for weaknesses. Found none. The cemetery's Victorian-era ironwork had been built to last. They reached the back gate, the one I'd chained and locked. The bearded one examined the chain, the padlock, tested it. Then he stepped back and raised the rifle. I moved without thinking, stepped out of the tree line, raised one hand. Don't. 5 faces snapped toward me. The rifle swung up, aimed at my chest. Everyone froze. I stood there 50 feet away, trying to look non-threatening while holding a blade on a pole. The absurdity wasn't lost on me. "The cemetery's occupied," I said. Kept my voice calm even. "I live here. The gates are locked for a reason." The bearded one didn't lower the rifle. "Occupied by who?" "You alone." I hesitated. Admitting I was alone was dangerous, but lying would be obvious. They'd seen no other signs of life. "Yeah, just me. Been here since the outbreak." "In a cemetery." One of the others spoke. Younger, skeptical. "You've been living in a cemetery for 3 months. 112 days. I corrected. "It's secure, fenced, defensible, has resources." The bearded one lowered the rifle slightly. "What kind of resources?" "Water, shelter, food, if you know how to grow it." I gestured vaguely toward the interior. "The infected wander through, but they're predictable, manageable." They exchanged looks. Some silent communication happening between people who'd survived together, who'd learned to trust each other. Finally, the bearded one spoke again. "My name's Carson. This is Derek, James, Lewis, and Tyler." He pointed to each in turn. "We're from the subdivisions east of here. Been holding out in a neighborhood association clubhouse. Supplies are running low." "Coal," I said. "Groundskeeper. Was a groundskeeper. Before the world ended," Derek said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. Silence stretched between us. 50 feet of space and 3 months of survival instinct. I was weighing risks. So were they. Finally, I made a choice. "The gates stay locked," I said. "But if you need water, there's a well. If you need information about the area, I've got sightlines from the hill. And if you've got supplies to trade, we can talk." Carson considered this, then nodded. "Fair. We've got medical supplies, batteries, some ammunition we can't use, wrong caliber for our weapons. You need any of that? Medical supplies? Yes. Batteries? Yes. Ammunition?" I thought about the handgun with no ammunition from the contractor's truck. "What caliber?" 9mm. About 40 rounds. "I've got a gun that fits." "No ammunition." "Then we've got a deal." Carson smiled, the expression strange on his face, like he'd forgotten how. "Water and information for medical supplies, batteries, and ammunition." "When?" "Tomorrow. Dawn. I'll meet you at the back gate." I paused. "Bring only what you want to trade. No weapons drawn unless I draw first. Deal?" "Deal." They left. I watched them disappear into the residential streets, then returned to the cottage. Sat on the front step and tried to process what I'd just done. I'd made contact, established trade, potentially allied with other survivors, or I'd just painted a target on my back. Either way, day 112 had changed everything. The isolation was breaking. For better or worse, my survival was no longer solitary, and I had absolutely no idea if that was good news or the beginning of the end.